We want to draw your attention to a rather undertold story that transpired a couple of years before World War II began. Did you know that Canada's Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, actually spent time in Germany and met with Adolf Hitler in hopes of convincing the dictator not to start a war? That story is told in 4 Days in Hitler's Germany, Mackenzie King's mission to avert a Second World War, and it brings the author, Ryerson University history professor, Robert Teigrob, to our studio. So nice to have you here.
Thanks for inviting me.
I got to say, I knew that the trip had taken place. I knew nothing about it, and I suspect most people in Canada don't know anything about this, so let's get into this. Mackenzie King decides he wants to visit Hitler's Germany 2 years before the war eventually broke out. What did he have in mind?
Well, journalists at the time thought he was there to kind of polish up a bilateral trade agreement that had been signed in spring and just make sure that things were going swimmingly. But King secretly thought that he would be a man to bring peace to the world and to convince Hitler that his great agenda for Germany should not be derailed by a global conflict.
King thought he could do this.
King had a tremendous sense of his own destiny for all his life, really, coming from both his ancestry. His grandfather was William Lyon Mackenzie.
First mayor of Toronto.
First mayor of Toronto, and a rebel who tried to democratize what was then Upper Canada. Mm-hmm. And King saw himself as the fulfillment of that destiny. But also, most Canadians will know King has some strange spiritual practices and beliefs, and he was convinced that he had been put on earth as a peacemaker, and as the ultimate peacemaker, really, as the world seemed to be sliding toward war in the 1930s.
Well, it wasn't such a crazy idea, actually, if you consider the two of them have some things in common, right? Adolf Hitler and William Lyon Mackenzie King. Let me go through a bit of a list here. King was born in Berlin. Now, that's Berlin, Ontario, present-day Kitchener, right? He spoke German. Like Hitler, he was a bachelor. They both had a deep attachment to their pets. Did King think that he could connect with Hitler better because of all of that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first of all those similarities softened King's attitude toward Hitler, and he thought anyone who is of similar mind regarding animals and a dedication to politics, which both of them shared. They really had no other interests outside of politics. And he was also convinced that Hitler was a spiritualist, which was a bit of a misreading, but King being the spiritualist, he thought that Hitler operated on a different plane than most people, and one that he could find common ground on. So yes, he thought that there would be enough there that they would be able to build a friendship, and King would then be able to maneuver Hitler toward a more peaceful foreign policy.
Now, we probably got to put ourselves in the headspace of 80 years ago, as opposed to looking at this through a lens of today. Today, we see, of course, Hitler's probably the worst evil man in the history of the world. But back then, many Western leaders were more worried about the spread of Soviet communism than fascism in Germany, right? So how did that filter things? And
King was certainly a leading proponent of that the real fear was leftism, was the Soviet Union, was class warfare, and his affection for Hitler had a lot to do with the fact that the Nazi program was seeking to make workers' lives better through vacations, through beautifying factories, by making them better well lit and cleaning them up. Now, what King wasn't seeing was that this was an Aryans-only labor improvement program. So there were certain limits to the benevolence of the state. But King saw this as a model that other nations should be following to forestall revolutionary leftism, and therefore anointed Hitler a kind of paradigm for the rest of the world to follow, at least with respect to labor relations.
Sheldon, just follow me here on page 2, bottom of the page. Let's put this picture up because Mackenzie King arrives in Nazi Germany. This is in 1937. Robert, what kind of a reception did he get when he arrived?
Well, he was treated like royalty. And this is something that flattery was something that really worked well for King. He loved to be wined and dined. He loved meeting elites in Britain and the United States. And here he was in Germany being treated as a celebrity. They were calling him His Excellency at every turn. And as we now know, they were taking time away from their plans to wreck Europe to sit down and talk with him about European policy, global policy, the League of Nations. And so he really felt that he was a guest of honor. And it, I think, only served to further cloud his judgment about what was really going on.
I noticed in that picture, Sheldon, I don't know if you want to bring it up again, but I noticed in the picture, they are using the fascist salute to him. I looked at all the pictures in your book. I don't ever see any of him using that salute back. Is that right?
No, and I don't think there is any record of that, and I would be shocked if, in fact, he was. But he certainly wasn't averse to being on the receiving end of this honorific. Yes.
Now, you do say in the book that Mackenzie King was anti-Semitic, as you know, many, if not most, Canadians of the day were. Did that help him overlook Hitler's anti-Semitism? Oh,
certainly. He did not, I mean, he keeps a running diary, and it's a very detailed diary, especially as he goes to Germany. This is the mission for which he's been waiting all his life, and so the detail in the diary gets incredibly heavy. But at no time does he bring up his concern over the treatment of the Jews or the absence of the Jews from the public square or any of the violence that had been widely reported in the foreign press with regard to moving Jews out of urban areas. So, yes, he is able to countenance Nazism to a greater degree because these types of things didn't bother him to the degree that they certainly should have.
Here's an excerpt from your book. We need to come to grips with why the Prime Minister was so taken by the Fuhrer. At least part of the explanation lay in the similarities King sensed between himself and his opposite number. It is a simple fact that in Hitler, the Prime Minister perceived something of a kindred spirit. Hitler's apparent mastery over the domestic political landscape captivated King. Why?
Well, King was one of the most capable politicians in Canadian history, which is why he is the longest-serving Prime Minister. And here was someone who, by the time King arrived in the mid-1930s, was, and this is a quote from Ian Kershaw, who wrote a biography of Hitler that was about 1,000 plus
it's a big
pages.
One. Yeah, it's a big one.
And Kershaw said that Hitler was probably the most popular politician and leader in the world at the time. Among his own people, at least. And that's something that King could really respect because he was constantly seeking to protect and expand his base and elongate his power. He marked the dates whenever he passed another politician in the British Commonwealth in terms of how long they'd served. And so Hitler's political success was something that, again, King could see as a kind of a genius and something that he himself pursued all his life.
The meeting eventually happens. It's in the Reich Presidential Palace. Set it up for us. Is it just the two men alone, or do they have entourages with them, or what?
No. Well, this is another controversy that occurs early on in King's visit, is that the British ambassador to Berlin, Neville Henderson, wants to accompany King to this meeting, and King is basically apoplectic at the thought of this because he wants to demonstrate an independent Canada. And this is another project that is a lifelong project for King. So Henderson is not there, but King has his personal secretary, Edward Pickering, with him. And Hitler is surrounded by aides, including Neurath, who's his foreign minister, and a couple of other high-ranking bureaucrats who are there because Hitler was dealing with meetings with other foreign dignitaries earlier in the day. But there were, I think, 12 or 13 people in the room, including translators.
Well, I was going to ask that. What language would they have spoken in that meeting?
King spoke exclusively in English, and Hitler had a grasp of English and would often nod in recognition before the phrases had been translated. King's German was pretty rudimentary, and I think it had fallen pretty much out of use by this point. He had grown up around German speakers and spent some time as a student in Berlin in 1900, to the point where he actually gave a couple of campaign speeches in the 19-teens, I believe it was, in German to the people of Berlin, Ontario. But especially in discussions of this import, I don't think he would try to resort to German for fear that something could be misconstrued and the world could explode.
Right.
So,
which it eventually did in a couple of years. How long did the meeting last?
it was scheduled for about 30 minutes, which is, I think, a testament to how little Hitler cared about the opinion of other world leaders by this point. But apparently it went for about 75 minutes or longer. I think Matthew Halton is the reporter who's the father of David Halton.
Yep.
And he's there reporting. And his comment, I think he's reporting for the Star, and he says that Hitler doesn't give anyone more than 15 minutes unless he finds a kindred spirit. So
apparently he did.
So King was not completely off his rocker to suggest that he could make a connection with Hitler, but I think King largely told Hitler what he wanted to hear and affirmed.
Yeah, Hitler said, "I don't want a war, don't worry, I'm not interested in bringing the world to..." Did King believe him?
Oh, absolutely.
He did believe him.
Absolutely. He said, "I found his pledges sincere," and he wrote this in his diary. He wrote it to Neville Chamberlain, the leader of Britain, to Lord Tweedsmuir, who was John Buchan, the Governor General. He said, "I am convinced that Germany will not resort to war, and Hitler has given me his word." And that was good enough for King.
That was good enough for King.
Yeah.
Hitler gave him a present. We're
did.
going to show a picture of it. Go ahead, bring it up, Sheldon, if you would. That is a picture of Adolf Hitler looking as statesmanlike as is possible, with a caption underneath it. Go ahead, Robert, tell us about that.
Yeah, in no fit of modesty, Hitler gives King a picture of himself with a silver frame, which is, I'm not sure if the National Archives still has that. This is where the picture is today. And it says, to His Right Honorable Excellency William Mackenzie King on the occasion of this visit, roughly translated, and the date. And King says that I will cherish this forever, and is profoundly moved. King had given Hitler a book about himself, which had been written by basically a political operative and was a campaign propaganda tool. And so King had something to give Hitler as well. I'm not sure where that ended up in Hitler's library or if he consulted it ever again.
Well, we know King thought this was the greatest day of his life because he told his personal secretary that.
He did.
Did he think that he had managed to avert a world war with that visit?
I think it's a combination of the assurances of Hitler, but also King counseling Hitler that his great project should not be derailed. That the combination of those two things made King tremendously confident that the future would not be what the future turned out to be, and that is a future where Nazis launched a premeditated war.
Well, we didn't have to wait too long to see that happen. I mean, Germany, less than a year later, moves into Austria with the Anschluss. Did that convince King that he needed to reevaluate that conversation?
For the first time, King begins to equate Hitler with other dictators in the world. In his diary, he writes, after the Anschluss, Hitler is certainly a dictator. But he always had this faith that, first of all, Hitler would not resort to war unless he was somehow maneuvered into it, that war was not ultimately Hitler's goal, and that the British would manage to appease Hitler to the extent that wider conflicts would not emerge from these local land grabs.
In February 1939, King writes Hitler a letter reminding him of their conversation. You promised me there would be no world war. Did he get a response to that letter?
He did. This was after, first of all, the Munich conference, which gave a portion of Czechoslovakia to Hitler, and then following spring, Hitler seizes all of Czechoslovakia. So this is prior to Hitler moving in to take the rest of Czechoslovakia. But King is concerned enough at this point that things might be pointing in the wrong direction, that he appeals to Hitler directly and says, as your friend, I'd like you to remember this. And Hitler responds eventually, but doesn't mention anything about conflict or his plans. He invites King to send a contingent of students on an exchange for the purpose of improving relations between Germans and Canadians. And that's something that King was actively planning for, and he himself was going to lead the delegation, and it was planned for November of 1939.
So it never happened.
So it never happened. If Hitler had delayed his invasion of Poland, perhaps King would have been in Germany at the time of the beginning of World War II, and who knows what would have happened then.
Well, let's go to that moment. Hitler's troops march into Poland. Did that finally shake King out of his admiration for Hitler?
His admiration had been sliding ever since the Anschluss with Austria. But he was still convinced that war would not come unless Hitler felt that he was backed into a corner. And even after the war started, he had a vision in which he said that a Pole had assassinated Hitler, and therefore the war would end within days. And that didn't turn out to be true. And at that point, King, in his diary, said, either a lying spirit has come in, or one wants to convince oneself of certain circumstances desperately. And he swore off seeking guidance from the dead for the duration of World War II, because it didn't seem to be clicking.
No kidding. Bring your historian's judgment to bear on this. Was this trip to Germany, 4 days in Hitler's Germany in 1937, was it worth King's doing?
Yes, yeah, and I write that quite forcefully in the conclusion that any attempts to negotiate as opposed to fight one's way out of problems should be applauded, but King did not, first of all, he didn't bring any concrete proposals to Hitler. He basically thought that if world leaders sat together and got to know one another, they'd get along and all problems would vanish. A very optimistic view of human nature, and quite naive.
Well, what are we to make of the appalling naivete that the British Empire's longest-serving prime minister demonstrated in front of the worst, most evil man in the history of the world?
It's problematic because, I mean, Maclean's has done a survey the past couple of years, 3 surveys about Canada's best prime minister, and twice King has ended up in first, and the other time he was a very, very close third by percentage points. And we have to, I think, look at how King reacted to really the most serious foreign policy crisis of his era, which he got tremendously wrong in every direction. Because, you know, historians praise his acumen, his political instincts, his ability to read people, and none of these seem to be on display in the most important negotiation of his life. And so, yeah, what are we to make of it? A reevaluation of King, to a certain extent, I think, is in order based on a story that's kind of been ignored in the Canadian record.
Indeed. So let's finish up by dealing with this question that you yourself ask in the book. Would a more responsible set of observations from King, communicated clearly to all involved, have made an iota of difference? What do you think?
I didn't answer it in the book, and I can't answer it now. But I make the point in the book that King told Hitler exactly what Hitler shouldn't have heard, and that is, Chamberlain is a friend to Germany and will go easy on you. And Hitler ran roughshod over him then in Munich. And King went back to Chamberlain and assured Chamberlain that Hitler would not pursue war and that war preparations were unnecessary. And again, that's something that Chamberlain precisely did not need to hear. So he's pushing in the wrong directions. If he had made statements opposite of those, it's difficult to say. I mean, he's a Canadian leader after all. We tend to be overlooked on the world stage.
But it's certainly one of the most massive miscalculations in world history.
It's up there.
It's up there,
yeah.
Yes, indeed. Well, more on this in 4 days in Hitler's Germany, Mackenzie King's mission to avert a Second World War, which he didn't do, but you got a good book out of it. There's Robert Teigrob. Thanks for coming into TVO tonight for this.
It was my pleasure.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.